Hey everybody, we're going to look at chapter 10 here, African Societies and Kingdoms, 1000 BCE to 1500 CE, about 2500 years. Um, Africa covers about 1/5 of the world's land surface. It is diverse in geography, ethnicity, language, culture. Um, the differences between northern and southern Africa can be as significant as between like England and China. I mean, just entirely different. Africa has the highest mountains and the hottest deserts and everything in between. So, very diverse place. And we will get started with this. Africa is home to very large geographical, well, better way to put it, I get climate regions, climatological regions. Everywhere from deserts to mountains to very large jungles. And pretty much all of Central Africa, other than the mountainous regions, is prairie, savanna, it would be called, grasslands, savanna grasslands. Um, all of it, most of the continent, whether it is dry or a tropical rainforest, is hot and tropical and very high temperatures. In the arid plain region, you're likely to have, you would likely have grasslands. You'd have hunting places for hunting game, hunting animals, and of course pastoralism. Pastoralism, that's herding of animals. Let's see what else we have. We have the wetter regions along the rivers and jungles, have grain crops, production of grain crops. Hunting and gathering took place all across Africa, whether it's in the savannas or the jungles. That's common as well. Um, Rivers and lakes throughout Africa also provide opportunities for fishing. Lots of water in certain parts of Africa, and other parts none. And of course, the whole continent's surrounded by the ocean, so lots of economic and simply food production capabilities through freshwater, rivers, lakes, and ocean water. Large mountains, large hilly regions, of course, would be ample opportunities for mining operations. And like today, for instance, we know that the largest reserves of rare and precious minerals on Earth are in Africa, hands down. Um, so, you know, most of the resources that are of the most value are not just laying on the ground. They require work, production, they require a lot of effort to acquire. And that's one of the things which really shapes Africa is the fact that the resources are all there, but they often require a lot of effort to acquire, um, which has really sort of shaped how Africa developed. In the north, we have coastal tribes intermingled with various trading entities, especially the Sahara Desert up towards the Mediterranean. They often, early history, traded with the Greeks, they traded with the Romans. And parts of northern Africa were part of the Roman Empire for a while. Of course, you had the country, the region, the empire, I guess is a better way to put it, the empire of Egypt up there. Um, Typically, the further south you went, you got darker skinned Africans. The further you got into the center of Africa, uh, race is a thing that is used today, but race is really a social construction. Means nothing, honestly. The reason we have different races on Earth is climate. It's simply the climate and temperature. That's what accounts for skin differences, color differences. So race is really meaningless. Literally, if we were going to use race in that way, it would be the same as saying we have a blue-eyed race, a brown-eyed race, we have a blonde hair race, a brown hair race, a black hair race, a red hair race. It's exactly the same thing. It's just simply different color of skin. It's no different than eye color, hair color. It's the idea of race is really ridiculous. Um, it was used obviously by Europeans to discriminate against those that were not white. What else we have? Northern Africa was, of course, heavily influenced by Islam in later years. All of northern Africa came under the influence and the domination of Islamic empires. East Coast was heavily influenced by the Arabians, Middle Easterners, and of course heavily influenced by India. East coast of Africa was much more likely, due to Africa's size, different regions of African peoples never even connected with each other. For instance, East African coast was much more likely that those Africans actually did business with the Indians across the water, much more likely than, say, doing business with Central Africans. Due to the incredible diverse size and scale of Africa, yeah, it simply made more sense to deal with people that were geographically closer. And India was closer to Eastern Africa coast than Central Africa was. So, we also see very southern Africa. We have Africans with very light skin, a yellow skin. So in northern Africa, they're a lighter, really lighter brown. Central Africa, usually much darker, very black. And then in southern Africa, almost a yellowish skin. So again, it has to do with climate. It has nothing to do with anything. It's just simply the climate influences skin color. Let's talk about northern Africa, talking about race, Egypt, and being African. The debate over race, of course, has been incredibly significant in the last 500 years. And today we use it to define many things, race. It's not a real biologic thing. If you ask an actual biologist, race is nothing. It doesn't mean anything whatsoever in actual scientific terms. It's really pseudoscientific, to be honest. It's really a sociology thing. It really has nothing to do with science. Many 19th century Africans could not conceive of the idea of let me back that up. Many 19th century Europeans could not conceive of the idea that Africans had advanced culture, advanced society, advanced cities, etc., etc., incredible art, things like this. So when they initially explored Africa in the 1700s and they came across these advanced cultures, when the majority of African people were living effectively in the Stone Age, many Europeans came up with these theses, these ideas to explain how there were advanced cultures in Africa. And the Hamitic thesis is one of these ideas. And it really is biblical in origin. It posited that the advanced technologies were actually brought to Africa by a white race identified as the Hamites, which doesn't exist, and it's named after Ham, which is a reference to the Bible, which was I'm not up on it really. It was like a son of Moses, maybe something like that, and again, don't quote me on that. And so it actually references a biblical reference, this imaginary race of Hamites or Hamitites, who then brought technology and culture to Africa. Course, all ridiculous. The culture and the technology that is found in Africa was really unique, as in much of technology that does develop in Africa in the BC area, the BC years, was actually independently developed. It was actually believed that Central Africans, all on their own, actually developed iron technology. Now, by the time Europeans show up, most Africans aren't using iron technology. It has actually fallen away. It's gone away, but it did exist years earlier, and it was probably independently created in Africa. So it was just a way for whites to dismiss African culture and society as inferior. Explain it, well, the only way they could have that is if whites gave it to them. It was a way to prop up white culture and white superiority. It was prejudicial. It was about white supremacy, really, European domination. Egypt does develop different than most of Africa, but that's because it has connections with the Mediterranean, Europeans, and Asians more than probably any other population. So Egypt develops a unique cultural identity. We've talked about Egypt before. We spent a lot of time talking about it. But of course, they had a deep history with the Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, Hebrews. They have their unique development, unlike anywhere else in Africa. And there's a debate. There still is a debate. What is Egypt? In other words, is Egypt Mediterranean or European? Is it Middle Eastern? Is it African? Because to really study the ancient world, You have to look at Egyptian culture right alongside Roman and Greek and Middle Eastern cultures. They're all blended, they're all connected. So Egypt is really not African. The African peoples in Egypt really had very little, incredibly limited connections with the rest of Africa. And that's because of the desert, Sahara. The Sahara Desert cut off Egypt from the rest of the continent. But it was very easy for them to communicate and trade with everyone else along the Mediterranean. So Egypt develops a very unique culture that is sets it aside and different than the rest of African culture. Well, there's certainly evidence on both sides that you could claim, because again, Egyptians are African. They're African. So you can simply make the very simple, basic argument they're African, so they're part of Africa. That is true. You can't really argue with that. But culturally, are they more African or are they more European or Asian? And that is really the argument is. You can really that argument can really be debated. Certainly could. We're never really going to get a straight answer on this because everyone has a bias towards it. So trying to come up with that answer, ultimately, what is it? The best answer is probably both. They are partly African culture and they're partly European Asian culture. Um, Maybe the simplest answer, but an answer that doesn't really make anybody happy. But I heard this statement the other day, someone made on a show or something I was watching, and it amounted to the fact of if nobody's happy when it comes to disagreements or discussions or compromise, then it's probably a successful compromise because nobody got what they wanted, but nobody's like everyone got a little bit of what they wanted, and so it's sort of like that. It's a compromise where no one's really happy. But again, that's just me really. Most historians probably come down one side or the other. It's easier for me just to say it's both. Here we have a knock woman. This is a very interesting cultural creation. This is culture. This is art. This is made out of terracotta. Given that there's hundreds of pieces like this that have been found across Africa, and production like this actually takes time, it's involved, it actually requires a process. It requires an actual industry to produce art and sculpture of this quality, this beauty, and to do this. Now, this particular one here could be a reconstruction, may not necessarily be an original, because I don't see any cracks on it hardly. And this would not have probably survived the ages, so it would have actually broken into pieces and they would have had to put it back together. This might be a reconstruction. Regardless, this is what an original would have looked like. So this really suggests a lot about knot culture, doesn't it? I mean, think about that. Good discussion question. What kind of complexity of life does it imply about knot culture that they were able to create this? And why did they create it? What does it mean? What is special about this woman? Remember, in most of world societies, as we've talked about, women don't have any real status, very limited status. Just spent the time and effort doing this and creating the sculpture of this woman. That indicates a lot. Could she have been someone important, someone significant? Would she have just been a regular common fisherwoman or farmer woman? Probably not. They didn't make sculptures of regular Joes, so there must have been something special about her. Um, what are these marks on her face? This over here and this over here. If you know anything about African culture, you may know the answer to that. Uh, you may understand exactly what those may or may not be. Um, African culture regarding jewelry and things like that. Um, she's suggested that she has wealth and status. Her hair is finely made up. It's got, I don't know if this is a hat of some sort, some type of a hair covering. The fact that her eyes are missing means it was probably a stone of some sort of precious stone. A gem, ivory. Ivory, of course, would have been very common in Africa. Seashells, different types of opalescent, really shiny seashells were often used in Africa, even as currency. So it could have been something like that, something very pretty, something shiny. So the wealth, the status of this, her jewelry, the hairdo, all of these things indicate what about her and who could she represent and why would they have made this of her? And does this say anything about women's status in Africa? Obviously, you cannot make a total correlation or hypothesis about one single piece of art. But assuming there's other pieces of art like this, and there's hundreds of pieces of art very similar to this, that does indicate something about the knot culture in Africa. Think about that. Talk about what it could mean, the significance of it, how it influences, how it was made, what it actually means about the industry itself. The fact that there had to be sort of an industry of making these terracotta sculptures. One individual person didn't just make this. Again, there were hundreds, there were thousands like this. So it was a whole industry. So it says a lot of things. Think about that. All right, this gives you an idea of the African continent, this massive continent, which I'm not even going to go into the whole deal of the map. You should look online sometime to look like, I don't know how to tell you to do it, but search for like the real map, like what a real map looks like of the world. You'll be blown away by what Africa looks like. Africa is shrunk down on the maps we use. It's like 70, 50, 70% of the actual size. And Europe is much bigger than it actually is in the real world. That's because Europeans drew these maps and designed these maps centuries ago to make Europe look really big and make other continents look small. Truth be told, India is bigger than Europe. Africa is way bigger than Europe. If you actually look at a real map, look it up online, what the real world looks like, it looks much different than the maps you've seen all your life growing up in school. And it really distorts it to make the Western European world look much more important, and the part of the world where people of color live look much less significant. It's amazing how this racism and prejudice seeps into all aspects of society, even freaking maps. Anyway, this is the African map. We have the Sahara here. This is why Egypt was separate. This is why Egypt was cut off, because the Sahara, in essence, which is one of the most desolate deserts on Earth, cut them off from the rest of the world. So, from the rest of the world, sorry, from the rest of Africa. But they were easily connected to the Mediterranean, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Arabian populations. Okay. This just shows you all different stuff. Wet, humid, tropical, desert, subdesert, Mediterranean, highland, savanna. In Central Africa, there's all kinds of mountains. Of course, this is where the human species evolved in Central Africa some 4 or 5 million years ago. The very first humans walked out of the Lake Victoria region. That's where humans evolved, the first bipedal humans walking around on 2 feet permanently. Um, so Africa really is it's the cradle of civilization. It's the cradle of human existence, human evolution, and of course, where were the first societies? Some of the earliest first societies on Earth were in Central Africa, Northern Africa, Egypt. So Africa doesn't get nearly the credit it should get. It has been marginalized by Europeans for 500 years. Early societies by 1000 BCE were typically farmers and pastoralists. We do see them using iron independently in Africa, separate from almost at the same time other parts of the world use iron, which is really surprising. Because the other places in the world usually seem to use iron by trade connections. And actually, just the way things work is you have so many different technologies that bump into each other, someone discovers iron and it spreads. Well, we believe Central Africans developed it entirely independently, which is just surprising anywhere, simply to develop a technology as significant and advanced as iron on your own. Plant cultivation was very common. Plant cultivation, which is actually growing and having farming crops, that's plant cultivation. That's having farms. That idea may have actually came from the Middle Eastern region, Judea region, Mesopotamia region, that traveled into Egypt, went up the Nile. This technology spreads up the Nile, up through into Central Africa, and the settled agriculture, of course, follows it. Wherever you can start growing crops is where cities start to develop. Starting as little villages, becoming cities, towns, stuff like that. But until you can grow permanent farms and crops, you can't have established communities. Probably learn the ideas. Probably a lot of it was thought to have learned from maybe Mesopotamia. Those are some examples of wheat of grain products. Those are all grains. Here in America, of course, we're used to wheat, but millet and sorghum are grain. And I have to correct myself because a yam is not a grain. Yam is a potato, right? So they're not all grains. Sorry. Um, let's see. The slash and burn method was often used. It's literally that they would just cut and burn everything down. They did this because it would all the dead plant matter and animal, because some animals would die too. All the dead organic matter would then soak into the soil and be absorbed into the soil and re-enrich the soil, so they could then come through and grow crops again. So they grow crops, then they would leave the land alone for a while. Nature would retake it, then they'd slash and burn everything. All the nutrients go into the ground, and it would make it very rich soil for growing crops, at least for a few years. This slash and burn technology, because the soil in Africa is actually terrible. Even places that get rain. Some people think rain means highly enriched soil. It does not. The actual problem with it was what the water actually did was suck all the nutrients out of the soil because they got so much rain in places that got rain. They often have monsoons. So they have regions that are just dry for months at a time, and then the rain comes. And when it rains, baby, it rains. It's like the flood. It's like Noah. I mean, it's a monsoon. And the problem is it rains so hard that it doesn't actually stay in the soil. It stay in the ground. All the rain hits the soil, and then all the rain, because it's so wet, it just washes out, and it actually sucks all the nutrients out with it, leaving very poor soil. So they had to do the slash and burn method to actually give any nutrients to the soil, because without the nutrients, you can't grow crops. It's very interesting. These were the most fertile areas when they would just cut and burn everything. They became the most fertile places to grow crops, at least for a few years. Indigenous cereal grains. We have millet. We have sorghum, like I said. We have wheat. Other plant varieties were often also grown and domesticated in Africa, like the taro, the sugarcane, um, bananas, cattle, sheep, pigs, donkeys. A lot of these animals and plants were not actually indigenous to Africa. They're actually thought to have brought probably along the trade routes, either trade routes with India on the east coast of Africa, or trade routes down the Nile River from Egypt. And again, they're not from Africa, so Egypt didn't have them either. So Egypt would have actually acquired them from trade routes with Europe and Asia in the Middle East, Mesopotamia, India, stuff like that. And then they just slowly over time migrates through the whole continent. What else we have going on there? Poultry, of course. I don't mention that on there. I don't think chickens. Bark, 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 chickens. Sorry, I saw that Cadbury commercial. I love Cadbury. Bark, bark, bark. Yeah, it's a rabbit, but I don't care what it sounds like as long as that keeps making that good chocolate. 'Cause that stuff's good. This is also the way wealth was measured in Africa, was in pretty much these domesticated plants and animals. For many years in Africa, for much of African history, wealth was measured in the amount of animals you owned. Often cows. Cattle was one of the biggest. So how many camels you owned, how many cows you owned, how many sheep, pigs, donkeys you owned. That was your wealth. Land ownership wasn't a thing in Africa really, because there was massive amounts of land. So owning land didn't really amount to much. It wasn't like in European society and many other parts of the world, land was wealth. Here, while the land was important, the land wasn't valuable. It was what you grew or raised or fed on your land that mattered. So the plant you grew and the animal that you took care of is what mattered. It wasn't really the land exactly. So land trading and land value and animal value, and sorry, back that up. No land, but animal value and plant value often figured into contracts, business dealings, wars, marriages. Uh, Settled populations take up all kinds of trades. We do see ironworking, which develops in Africa about the same time it develops in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And then ironworking eventually disappears. Um, It's there for centuries probably, and then the technology just sort of fades away. Probably learn again, probably independently developed. Population increase was also a result of the peoples. More food equals more people, and so on and so forth. And so settled life brings with it population increases, as it always does anywhere. Next thing we'll talk about are the migrations, the Bantu migration. So this is a linguistic classification. Bantu is a linguistic classification. People that speak a form of Bantu language, mostly common in Central and Eastern Africa in this time. Bantu languages include things like Swahili, Zulu, Sotho, Swana. Um, Oddly enough, even though they're the first people to really form societies in Africa, the Bantu peoples are really the first societies in Africa. Few actually wrote down their languages. We have almost no actual record. We believe these are the first civilizations in Africa. May have even predated Egypt, but they didn't write anything down. We have archaeological, is that the right term? We have evidence of like towns or villages, but no writing that we have a record of, really. Uh, which is how we often determine civilization. That's how we define history, for instance. History is when we have an actual written record. Anything before written record isn't actually history, at least as far as we're concerned. That's prehistory. So, reasons for the migrations are unclear. Why did all the Bantu peoples, which had civilizations in Central Africa, abandon their towns and start migrating across the entire continent? Why? When exactly did it happen? It's hard to really say. Hard to really say. The dates are also unclear. We think that maybe rapid population growth may have caused it. They simply ran out of food. Central Africa is very sparse on food. It's all these grasslands, savannas. Very tough to acquire food and resources. They settled down. Once you settle down, you start growing some type of crops or some type of permanent settlement, and then population booms and they ran out of food. So that may be one of the reasons for their migrations. They traveled into Eastern and Southern African territories, or they created kingdoms in Central Africa. These Central African kingdoms really forced them to expand and move and travel. Why they're very important, we think it's very likely the Bantu are the most direct descendants of early Homo sapiens. Um, the most direct, closest descendants of Homo sapiens that stayed home, if you will. Most other Homo sapiens left Africa 250,000 years earlier, give or take, and then spread around the world. But this one group of Homo sapiens, we believe are the Bantu, they did not. And that's the way it worked, of course. Population spread out. But if there's someone who's there and everyone else leaves, then why would you leave? So somebody had to stay around. Somebody stayed back to enjoy the civilization that were already developing while the other people went and spread around. Well, these are the ones that stayed. Um, and so, really, they probably assimilated or brought in all the other types of humans all across Central Africa over thousands and tens of thousands of years. And we think much of African culture, the majority of African culture as we think of it, really probably has been handed down or has evolved, culturally evolved from this Bantu culture, really. Um, Definitely. It's a totally unique culture because Central African culture was entirely independent. It developed unique. It wasn't influenced by Europe. It wasn't influenced by Egypt. Probably wasn't influenced by Asia. It was an entirely unique, different culture, as opposed to anywhere else in the old world we've talked about. Anywhere else in the old world we've talked about, Northern Africa, Europe, Asia, India, China, everything. All those cultures were connected. All of them shared ideas, shared technologies. Uh, None of those cultures developed in a vacuum. Central and Southern African cultures probably did develop in a vacuum, entirely unique and independent. Very interesting. This gives you an idea of some of the Bantu homeland here in Central and Western Africa, and then they spread out through the rest of the continent. And so the ancestors of probably almost all Africans today, with the exception of Egyptians and Northern Africans on North Sahara, pretty much everywhere else in Africa, most likely all African peoples are descended from the Bantu. They were the original African tribespeople. Um, soon as the first humans moved out of the Stone Age and started having fire and building towns and villages, this was them. And all other Africans probably are from them in some way or another, because they eventually spread out across almost the entire continent. Very interesting. Life in the kingdoms of the Western Sudan region, 1000. Sudan. Today, do not get it confused. Today, there's a country of Sudan, which is in a whole other place. The country of Sudan in Africa has nothing to do with this. This is the Sudan region having to do with the Sudan Desert. Entirely separate from the modern country of Sudan. Same name, but really not connected. This is really where the very first cities and kingdoms we see in Africa, other than Egypt, is right here. And you can see them here on the map. This region of the Western Sudan. I think the actual modern country Sudan is like way over here in Eastern Africa, I believe. We're going to mention each of these: Songhai, Ghana, the Mali, the Kingdom of Gao. We'll mention each one of them a little bit. Here we're in the year 1000 BCE to the year 800. The Senegal and the Niger River population, same thing here as everywhere else. Same exact thing. The first civilizations and cities developed along rivers, freshwater rivers. Exactly the same as every other early culture. Here it was the Senegal and the Niger rivers in Western Africa. You see them here, these rivers. They provided fertile soil for agricultural production, rice, millet, sorghum, of course, fishing. Fishing, very important. Luckily, in Western Africa, they had access to both ocean fish and freshwater fish, so they had access to both. Most of these populations were kin groups. They were associated with kinship. They were all family related in some way or another, or extended families. They were usually governed by a male village chief. Sometimes there was a king. If it was a larger group of tribes, it would be an actual king, and the king was often thought to be semi-divine. The king was often thought to be a mortal. The term we would use if you want to use Greek culture is a demigod. In other words, they were half human, half god. This divine, semi-divine culture. Semi-divine chief was the leader of their culture. They usually would have a. I do want to one last comment. The chief priest was also the king in most of these early cultures. The king or the leader of the village was also the chief priest. So he was also the one responsible for communing with the gods and asking for God's blessings. Um, as more and more villages get together and form kingdoms, you do find kings, lots of kings, um, across Africa, Western Africa. It was also common for the king to share power with a what they would call a queen mother. African culture put incredibly high emphasis on reproduction, and the reason for that is probably because it was such a hard life. Infant mortality rates were high. Mortality rates in general were higher due to all the different diseases and the wild animals. I mean, Africa is a freaking dangerous place. Everything there will kill you. There's dozens of different types of creatures in Africa that can kill you with one contact, whether it's a sting, a bite, whatever. Africa has like 25 deadly poison frogs that you can literally, if you were just to touch them, rub up against them, it could kill you. So there's just so many things in Africa that can kill you. Mortality was very high. Mortality rates were high. It was a very dangerous place, and resources were very limited. As a result of this, they placed a very high premium on reproductive ability. Women had much higher status in Africa, probably in general, probably higher status than maybe any culture we've discussed. Women could run villages. It was common for warriors to go out and hunt, and the village would be left in the hands of the queen mother. She would run the village for an indeterminate amount of time. and women as mothers, religiously as well. Almost all African cultures, their religious, spiritual beliefs, and we call these animistic, meaning that they're basically about nature and spirits and deities and things like this that are all part of nature spirits. Almost all begin with the idea of a mother or a female fertility type of goddess. Were incredibly important to their culture because it was just such a dangerous and rough place. You had to put a high focus on reproduction, otherwise your population would simply die out. I mentioned animism. They had this belief in animistic beliefs, of course, polytheistic, believing in hundreds of, not like the Roman and Greek type of gods. These were actually gods of nature, tree gods, water gods, animal gods, weather gods. These were not like these human looking gods that governed over entire sectors of society. It wasn't exactly the same thing. Um, Female authority was actually pretty strong. As I mentioned, some tribes were known to have actual female chiefs. They often had a ruling council. It was often common for these tribes to have a council. So you could have a queen mother, you could have a king, you could have a ruling council, all these kinds of things. Um, Religion was incredibly significant. They looked for the different gods. They believed in nature spirits. They believed in blessings. They believed in curses. They believed in magic. We would call this religious belief that we have in Africa is probably more in line with what we would understand today as magic. Maybe less what we think of as like European style religion. It's really more like magic, really. They had spells, they curses, potions, all kinds of things like that. Now, Rome had both. Rome had religion and Rome had magic. Um, Greeks had magic too, to a limited degree. But this is not necessarily traditional religion that Europeans are used to, that the Americans are used to. It doesn't really mesh with like Christianity. It's a different kind of thing. Kings were involved in this, women were involved in this, and all this together really helps keep people together. This idea of kinship and kingship. Don't get those confused. It's one letter different. Kinship is family relations, and families and these councils that were often made up of family relatives would be the ones that choose kings. And we do think pretty much all Africans had a shared religious belief. Now, to be clear on this, they all believed in different types of spirits and gods and different types of entities, ghosts and things like this, and different animal and nature spirits. So one village to another might focus on different nature spirits. But as far as the type of this animistic belief was pretty much common throughout the whole continent, this type of religious belief, which gave them a shared culture. They had a shared ancestry, a shared way of governance, a shared culture, and often a shared language. As I said a bit ago, I don't know if you caught it or not, the Bantu we refer to isn't exactly an ethnicity. The Bantu actually, more than anything, refers to a language system. It's really about linguistics. The Bantu culture is aligned with the language. Well, that means they also shared a language, even though there were lots of different dialects, hundreds of dialects even. The root of pretty much all African language, other than along the Mediterranean, was thought to come from Bantu. So they all, even the different dialects, they all had a similar cultural language that was similar, even if different. So ultimately, Africans shared far more than was different between the different peoples, even though some of them were literally separated by thousands and thousands of miles. Very interesting. The Berbers of North Africa. These became the merchants of the desert. Picture there. They were able to travel using camels. They could survive for months in the deadly Sahara Desert, where everybody else would die. Caravan routes between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sudan were established by the Berbers. Pretty much the only ones able to accomplish this task of safely crossing the desert. Most caravan travel was done at night, of course, due to the heat. Water was very important. Often they guided the caravans, they ran the caravans eventually, and they charged a nice price. They're usually the only ones that knew where the oases were. because to travel across the desert not knowing where you could stop and find water, well, it was a death sentence for most. But the Berbers knew. They knew where the oasis was. They knew where to do it, where you could stop and water the animals and rest, and there'd be some trees. Caravans along the routes were also threatened by the Tuareg. The Tuareg were Berbers, but they were sort of the bad Berbers. They were the raiders. They were the pirates of the desert. They would attack the trade caravans, and that's where they got their wealth. They would get their wealth, money, supplies, goods, food, weapons. They would just steal it. They would steal them from the caravans. Um, this was pretty much their entire economy. The Tuareg's entire way of life centered around stealing from the trade caravans that went across the Sahara Desert. It was war. People fought and died over these caravans. They were, I mean, literally the difference between life and death. If you weren't able to get the supplies from the caravans, you would starve to death or die of dehydration or starvation. I mean, it was bad. The caravans were sort of the lifeblood of many of the communities that lived in and around the deserts. Don't get me wrong, there weren't many. It was a very sparse population, but there was a handful of cities, a handful of towns, especially along the fringes of the desert, and the caravans were their lifeblood of what really kept them going. You'd find water wells occasionally, as I said. You'd find the oases occasionally, and also it was known that they would sometimes poison these these natural springs or these oases. They would poison them. It was a way of it was a way of warfare actually between different tribes. Yeah, dangerous. This Trans-Saharan trade had three important effects on African society. First, the increase in trade really influenced the development of gold mining. Gold mining was exported on the trade routes to the Mediterranean, to the Indian Ocean. It was used to pay for silks from China, used to pay for spices from India. It really linked the known world at the time. So, yes, the Silk Roads that connected China to Europe and the Mediterranean did also extend into the Sahara Desert, due specifically to the gold. Of course, a lot of money involved that. Another thing which really went with the gold too was salt. There was a really big salt trade, which is a version of a spice at the time. Second, slaves became a very common commodity traded in the Sahara trade routes. Slaves were used to export, of course, to the Middle East, to Asia. That's generally where the slaves went in this time period, was to the Middle East, to India, to China. Labor, of course, for the work in Africa itself, the salt mines, the gold mines, other types of production. See what else? Many Africans were forced into Muslim military service in later years. When Islam comes along, we see many Africans forced into as slave soldiers. This is actually common practice in Islam to take conquered populations and enslave them, this men as soldiers. We saw this in Turkey, for instance, the Turks. We saw this here in Northern Africa. Hell, we even saw it with Christians. It was not something they also did. They would enslave Christians and make them into soldiers in the Muslim armies. We saw that happening. Millions of Africans were enslaved long before Europeans ever showed up. So the slave trade that we're most familiar with, of course, is the African slave trade that brought Africans to the Americas, which was originally really created by the Portuguese. But millions and millions of Africans were enslaved long before the Europeans ever started doing it. It's actually one of the reasons the Europeans started doing it. When they started to explore and to come into contact with Africa along the coast, uh, the Africans wanted to trade with Europeans, wanted to trade goods. Europeans had all kinds of things to trade. Africans didn't have a lot of things of value. They had a few natural resources. um, gold and salt and a few other things like ivory. What one of the resources they had though that was of high value was other Africans as slaves. Um, yeah. Also had nothing to do with skin color. Slavery in this time had zero to do with skin color. It was slavery was slavery of opportunity or warfare or debt slavery. People would even sell themselves into slavery on purpose for the purpose of protection. If you're a poor person, you don't have a job, you don't have any type of skill, you can't take care of yourself, you can't make enough money to feed your family, you might actually sell yourself into slavery because it would provide. You had to provide health care, shelter, food for a slave. So it was a way of actually taking care of yourself if you were unable to otherwise. That also would happen. Urban market centers often developed. These trade routes produced a lot of wealth, a lot of treasure. This really stimulated the development of cities, urban markets, especially in northern Africa. Once Islam comes along, Muslim merchants really became the leaders in these trade routes between the Mediterranean and the Sudan, and then, of course, extending into Arabia. By the early, I don't know, by the 500 to 1000 CE, the current era, we really find Africa, Europe, and Asia entirely interlinked. Not just Egypt, but big parts of the continent were interlinked, as we'll discuss as we go through this. The spread of Islam in Africa. One of the most significant results of Islam was this association of trade in Islam, and it was really brought into Central Africa and Northern Africa by the Berbers, because Islam followed the trade routes. The Berbers were the merchants, so Islam was transferred to the Berbers. The Berbers converted, and then the Berbers convert everyone else they trade with. So Arab invaders conquered northern Africa in the 7th and 8th centuries. They introduced Islam to the Berbers. Many people traded with the Berbers, therefore actually converted to Islam so that they could trade with the Berbers, because the Berbers were now converted over to using Arabic as language of trade and business, and of course their religion was now Islamic, Muslim. So the people they traded with found it was most convenient to speak the same language, have the same beliefs, hoping to actually get more favorable relations with the Berbers. Because if you were favorable with the Berbers, it would be profitable for you. Uh, so it was relatively easy to convert to Islam. Uh, they would do that. They would learn Arabic, and it really helps and facilitates the spread of Islam through Africa. Also, positions of authority. You wanted to maintain positions of authority in the Islamic society, and you could have no position of authority. You could have no type of social status in Islamic society. High social status couldn't exist unless you were Muslim and you spoke Arabic. So if you wanted to maintain your social status as the Muslim empires come in and take over, you have no choice. Otherwise, you become a commoner. And most commoners didn't convert. Most commoners were not actually converted over. So you didn't have to, but then you'd be a commoner. You could lose your status, lose your wealth, lose your business contacts. You could lose everything. So most were simply willing to convert for economic reasons, for status reasons. The empire that eventually takes over northern Africa, we haven't really talked about it, is the Almoravid. They're the ones that sort of move in and take over northern Africa after everything in the 200 years after Muhammad, when we had all the deal with the Abbasid and the caliphates in northern Africa, the caliphate in Spain, the Fatimids in Egypt. This is a empire which sort of takes over the northern Africa border all the way over into Spain and northern Africa along the Mediterranean. The Fatimids are still there. The Fatimid Caliphate, which is pretty much governs what was Egypt, that still is there. But from Egypt all the way over to Spain is now the Almoravids, and they become the dominant Muslim power in I don't know, like 900s, we'll say, CE. I'm just sort of tossing that date out there, but it's approximately that time period. Somewhere in that time period, they become the dominant empire, Muslim empire in northern Africa. They start to spread the technology because Islam and the Muslim world was probably the most advanced technological civilization at the time. They had the most advanced math, science, learning. We've already talked about that. So they spread a lot of that new technology and learning and advanced math and science and biology, medicine. They spread a lot of that. Brewed new cultures, new science. For instance, the Muslims taught the king of Ghana, for as a good example. The Muslims taught the king of Ghana how to make and build with bricks. They'd never used bricks before. Before that, they were building everything with mud and clay. While it is sturdy once it hardens in the sun, it's almost hard as stone. Because the rains come every year, literally, your house melts down. So in the summer, it becomes hard as stone, but it's made of this mud and clay substance that when the heavy rains come, your house actually dissolves. So they have to rebuild or repair constantly. So the Muslims teach them how to make actual solid bricks, which is a permanent construction. They set up new schools, new technologies. They set up hospitals. Um, of course, the Muslim schools are really based upon the madrasas. They were really based upon religious schools, but nonetheless, it was still education. It was still a formal, official education that had never really existed in Africa outside of Egypt. And so they bring formal education, schooling. Um, Eventually, there's so many advantages to the Muslim society, which is far more advanced technologically, culturally, religiously, economically than anything else in Africa. Most other rulers in Northern Africa readily convert. It's just easier. It's beneficial in every way. You give up your old religion, you accept a new religion. If it was just an even trade, most people wouldn't have done it. But it wasn't an even trade. It was actually a very beneficial trade. You accept a new religion, plus you have all the economic benefits, the cultural benefits, the status benefits, the technology, there's just, the list goes on. It's no surprise that so many cultures readily converted and accepted Islam across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Um, it just isn't any surprise. They were the most advanced society, really, that existed at the time by the year 1000. And that was due to their position. They were at the center of the trade routes, they were at the center of the world. All technology, all science, all learning, everything had to pass through Muslim lands. They were right at the heart of it, the core. So everything crisscrossed through Muslim lands, so they got everything. They knew all the best science, all the best math, all the best culture, all the best biology and they had everything. And they had their choice. They could pick and choose everything they wanted that they thought was the best, and they did, and that's what really helped them make them so advanced. Islam eventually crosses the Red Sea right here over into from Arabia into northern Africa, eastern Africa. Eventually, the entire coast of eastern Africa becomes Muslim. You can actually see this map here, which is very interesting. Look at it, and you can see how it spreads. The darkest area is where Muslim Islam is initially. Then the next green area is the next wave of Islam, spreading all the way into China, all the way into Southeast Asia, into India, all of northern Africa. Then you get a much lighter wave coming after that, a much lighter wave coming after that. And so by 1500, you've got half of Africa is Islamic, all of the east coast of Africa is Islamic, of course, the Middle East, all the way into Central Asia, all the way to China, all the way into Southeast Asia. And then eventually, you see it actually spreading all the way into the rest of the world. Now, this, of course, is to present, 1500 to present. And you can see the spread of Islam in present world. We see Islam dominant in a little bit of South America, of course, the east coast of America, a lot of Islamic people eventually. Asia, or pardon me, Europe, a lot of Islamic populations. Um, Many people would say today, where are most Muslim people? And most would say, well, Middle East, of course. No. The majority of Muslim people in the world are Southeast Asia, east of India. That's where the largest population of Muslims are in the world, not the Middle East. East African coast, I just covered that. Let's see, we want to talk about that. That really covers that. Oh, and that's really how one of the ways it helps spread into Asia. East African coast converts over, and a lot of that actually because there was so much trade between East Africa and India that it helps actually spread it. It helps it spread into Asia. Eventually, about half of India is actually Islamic, or not the whole population, but Islam is in about half of India. I'm going to say that properly. It was never a majority of the population by any means, but Islam spreads all through northern India. And eventually it becomes so dominant in northern India that it actually breaks off and it forms its own country. That's Pakistan, I believe. I believe so. Pakistan was part of India, but there were so many Muslims, so many millions of Muslims that eventually it separates off and they have mass migration and they end up forming their own country. So, all right. From Arabia across the Red Sea, I just covered that. And let's look at this. What is this here? This is also show the spread of Islam all the way through northern Africa, eastern. It's just sort of a more of a blow up and a little bit better detailed map than what we just saw. Nothing new here, I don't think, from what I just showed you. All right, African kingdoms. African kingdoms. From 800 to 1500, in this period of about 700 years, we see several empires arise in Africa that left their influence on later life and, of course, the economics of Africa. The Kingdom of Ghana from about 900 to 1100. Ghana was an indigenous tribe identified as the Soninke people, the Soninke peoples. They called their ruler a Ghana, a war chief. The Ghana was a war chief of the ruler. Now, this Kingdom of Ghana is how we ended up calling it the Kingdom of Ghana, named after their warrior, war chief. It occupied Western Africa and the Sudan region, south of the Sahara. So that entire region we looked at on that earlier map. It took control of their caravan routes all through the Sahara. Eventually, it captures the town of Ouaddagost. Sure, Ouaddagost, we'll go with that. From the Berbers, it was a Berber town, and it becomes the western point of the trade routes. Ouaddagost becomes basically the western hub of the Silk Roads as it went all the way through the Sahara and eventually made it across the Sahara Desert into the western corner of Africa, the northwestern corner of Africa, and that was it. That was Ouaddagost. It was sort of the end of the road, if you will, for the trade routes into Africa, which gave this nation, which eventually becomes this nation, this kingdom, perfect way to become rich and wealthy. All trade routes that went through Africa eventually came through them. Biggest source of wealth in the entire world in this time period was trade. Good and successful merchants could make more money than kings. The Ghanaian king locates his court, his entire government. He locates it in the city of Kumbi, Kumbi Salah. His kingdom is heavily influenced by Muslim travelers, heavily influenced by the Muslim government. There were Muslim populations that lived there, and they were originally separate, and they developed their own vibrant intellectual center. They built schools, and eventually, due to the success and the authority and the culture brought by the Muslims, eventually the religion spreads. But initially, they were just merchants along the trade routes. But for the reasons we already talked about, to facilitate better trade, to have higher status, to get better deals and contracts, you would convert over to Islam. It would simply make business dealings easier and allow you to accumulate wealth and status quicker. The king was everything. The king was chief judge in the city. He was heavily influenced by Islamic law. He was in charge of trade and justice. Of course, he also had to have money. Empires require lots of money, lots of income, lots of tax revenue. So he had to have that as well. This was the largest empire in Africa at the time. So in the year 1000, this was the greatest empire in the African continent. It was probably the Kingdom of Ghana. Subordinate chieftains paid tribute. He was a chief of chief, a king of kings. In European society, he might have been classified as an emperor. I don't think that's terminology they really used in Africa. He was a Ghana, but Europeans would have probably classified him as an emperor because he had multiple other kings actually owing allegiance to him. They gave tribute to him. I mean, they gave some of their wealth, some of their treasure to him. Merchants entering the kingdom and leaving the kingdom were charged fees on things they traded. They most often traded things like gold, slaves, weapons, salt. These right here are salt bricks, in case you're wondering what they are. They're bricks of salt. They would cut them right out of the ground. They would just cut them right out of the ground like stone or like rock, and they were just solid bars of salt. Very much useful for food and food production. Plus, what else do you use salt for in a period before refrigeration? You can actually salt foods, and it preserves. Salt is a preservative. So you can take meats and fruits and you can salt them, and they can sometimes last for years. And if you didn't do that, of course, they would go bad. They would spoil. But salt, it was what they used to preserve foods before refrigeration so that your foods could survive for long periods of time without going bad. Very interesting. So salt was incredibly useful, especially in a place like Africa where food was limited in places and getting food was difficult. If you ever got a large surplus of food, you had to ensure you could protect it and keep it and store it. And you couldn't do that unless you could find some way to preserve it. Salt. Let's see what else we'll talk about there. Anything else? No, that's it. Kingdom of Ghana is here. This is the Kingdom of Ghana right here. Ghana 900 1100. Then we'll talk about these others in just a moment. Talk about a few of them. Here's the region of Sudan. Again, not to be confused with the country of Sudan. The country of Sudan today is like over here. Totally different thing. And you can see all these different trade routes, these Saharan trade routes, these purple lines. This is also the time when they start doing cross-water trade. We start seeing ships coming out of Europe. And the Europeans begin the voyages of exploration. In the 11, 12, 1300s, the Europeans start looking outside their borders and start traveling the world or starting to travel the world. First places they hit are Africa. But this is when it begins. This is when Europe begins its domination of the globe. Kingdom of Mali, 1200 to 1450. This really rises out of the ashes of Ghana. This is the kingdom that comes along in the same region after the fall of Ghana. And this is founded on the Mandinka people, Mandinka peoples. By the way, all these people are thought to be descendants of the Bantu. The Mandinka people lived, the people were the largest population in the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire. Well, the Mali Empire was greater than Ghana. It was large due to wealth, agriculture, and trade, and had some great leaders, a couple of great leaders I'll mention. This trade and production supported a large population in Mali, the region of Mali. The capital city was Niani. Eventually, this becomes a major trade and financial center, this region of Niani. Sundiata is the founder of the Mali kingdom. Founded in 1230, it begins Mali's imperial expansion, conquers Ghana, increases its power by taking control of other cities along the trade routes in the Sahel region. Sahel, do I have it on my notes? Sahel. What is the Sahel? The Sahel is the intermediate zone along the southern edge of the Sahara. What does that mean? It's the region that is marginally livable. It is the region where you can actually start to live. It is still desert-ish with very limited rainfall, but it's not completely dry like the desert. It is the very edge of the southern Sahara where it can actually sustain life. In the Sahara, the only place that can sustain life is if you find an oasis. If you find an oasis or a little place where there's water, that's it. The rest of the desert's really uninhabitable. But the Sahel region is entirely inhabitable because it has limited amount of rain and a little bit of grass. It is still really rough to live there. It's really challenging, but it's doable, at least if you know how to do it. So it's that transition zone from unlivable desert land to the actual more comfortable, livable, moderate, temperate land in Central Africa. So this becomes a major trade center. Mali was founded, takes control of several cities along the trade routes in the Sahel region. Well, following that is Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa takes the empire to its greatest glory in the 14th century. He converts to Islam. He makes the pilgrimage to Mecca. He goes all the way to Mecca, which at this point in time, that was hell the other side of the world. That was thousands of miles away. Uh, he stops in Egypt. He stops in Cairo. He carries all kinds of treasures with him. He carries all kinds of wealth and treasure and gifts. And he gives out gifts to kings along the whole way. Now, why does he give out all these gifts? The implication is if you can give out all kinds of treasure and gifts, you must be just incredibly powerful and wealthy. If you can give away all your money and you still have your wealth and status, that indicates you just must be super wealthy, super powerful. He did all this to display how powerful Mali was. To indicate Mali is so wealthy and so powerful, I can give out all this treasure and wealth, and it doesn't even mean anything to us. No big deal. It's like that song. There's that song that was on the radio last year. I can't remember the name of it exactly. In the song, he's talking about, I like one of the lines is, "I put a Richard on a card." It's a rap song. You want to know what that is? You know what that means? A Richard is a type of watch. So you just can't just sort of off the cuff, I just put a Richard on the card. It's no big deal. Not a big thing at all. A Richard is a type of specialty watch that can go up to $200,000 for a freaking wristwatch. So that by that statement, it indicates he's so wealthy, he's got so much money, he wouldn't even think twice. It's just nothing just to blow $200,000 on a watch. That's what Mansa Musa was doing, demonstrating he was so wealthy. It didn't mean jack shit to just be handing out treasure and wealth everywhere he went. Didn't mean anything. And in truth, that was how powerful Mali was. After Ghana, Mali was the most powerful kingdom in Africa. Incredibly wealthy. It controlled the trade routes. It controlled the gold mines, the salt mines. Almost all of Western Africa, it was mega wealthy by any standards. Um, Very interesting. This brings a lot more connections between the Middle East and Africa. And eventually, this really brings the total complete transfer of Islam into Central Africa. Because Islam was so connected to the trade routes, and Mansa Musa was so connected to Islam, and he really credited Islam for his status and his wealth and his power. Well, it really grows the influence of Islam in Central and Northern Africa. Really makes it much more successful and expansive. After he returns back home, he commissions architects to build giant mosques in the city of Timbuktu. And yes, that's a real place. If you've ever heard of Timbuktu, that's a real city. He builds mosques, multiple mosques, large Islamic temples in Timbuktu. And this becomes the center of Islamic culture in Africa. Becomes actually a thriving city because of Islam. Because the Islamic trade routes now were going to Timbuktu, because that's where the Islamic merchants wanted to go to, because it was a holy site in Africa. It became a holy religious site in Africa for Islam as a result of what Mansa Musa did. He actually brought back treasure. He actually brought back like religious symbols. Even though Islam doesn't really have symbology, they don't really believe in idols. He did bring back writings and scriptures and books and other types of Islamic writings, and he creates a religious center in Timbuktu for Islam. in northern Africa. Um, Other than Cairo, this was the most significant Islamic site in all of Africa, other than Cairo itself, Cairo, Egypt. It also becomes an Islamic center, eventually filling up with dozens of schools, dozens of mosques. Um, Quite interesting. There's Niani, which became the capital. There's Kumbasale. There's Timbuktu right here. And this is the Sahel region, really. Right up here is the Sahara Desert. This is that region that is just livable. It is okay to live. It's okay to survive as long as you're in the right place. It doesn't have the prosperity as you get down here into more this region here, which has a lot more jungles, a lot more vegetation. It is still semi-desert, a lot of it, but its location was perfect because it was basically the closest they could get into the desert to build large cities that connected to the trade routes. And that was what most important. The trade routes were all the money and status and power was. So you had to connect to the trade routes. You had to basically get as close as you could to the Mediterranean and the Middle East while still staying out of the desert where life couldn't really thrive. It became pretty big. I mean, this is a pretty big empire at the time. Um, Pretty good size. Starts here in this region. This was basically Ghana. Grows here, grows here, it just gets bigger and bigger. Actually, the other way around, I apologize. It grows here, becomes this at its height in 1300, and then by 1500 it shrunk back down to this. So it starts around Niani, grows to the lighter pink, and then by the end of its time, it's actually shrunk back down to here. All these empires in Africa work this way. It's a bell curve. They're small, they become great, and then they simply fade away. Happens to all of them. They all follow that same path. Ethiopia we'll talk about next. So in Ethiopia, the Christian kingdom of Axum. Um, how did this become a Christian kingdom of Axum? Well, probably the most likely is Roman Egypt. When Egypt was part of Rome, Christianity did spread there. We did know there were Christian monks, there were Christian monasteries in northern Africa. Most likely, then it spread down through the Nile, down to Nubia, and then from Nubia down into Axum. Most likely is how it got there. There was a pretty strong Christian influence in the deserts of northern Africa, in and around Egypt. Lots of monasteries, lots of hermits, ascetics, people that go out and like live in caves or sit on top of poles. Yeah, interesting stuff. Um, well, this is the modern, what we call Ethiopia. So Ethiopians maintain these early Egyptian religious beliefs. Probably they were influenced by Egyptian religious beliefs handed down to them from the Nubians. Nubia was at one point part of Egypt, part of southern Egypt. So Nubia was heavily influenced by Egypt, and then Axum was probably trade partners with Nubia, and that's probably how it all works its way down to this region of Axum. Eventually converted by Christian missionaries from Egypt and the Middle East. There was a Christian, what do we want to call this? Like a monk, maybe? A Christian monk, Frumentius. That just sounds like a Roman name, right? Frumentius. He's credited for really bringing Christianity into Axum around the 4th century, or the 4th century CE. Overall, society was heavily influenced by all three major religions in the region. This is that region of the east edge of Africa, which is really close to the Middle East, really close to the Arabian Peninsula and the water, which would have had trade connections. So whether it was overland connections through Egypt, trade connections through the Red or Indian Seas, we find that this entire region of Axum is heavily influenced by both Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. We find evidence of churches and temples of all three in this region. Very interesting because this is a long ways. This is really a long ways from what we normally think of as Christian or Judaic regions. It's quite interesting. Ultimately, Christianity was the one that becomes the strongest influence, And Axum, which eventually is Ethiopia, becomes really the only Christian kingdom on the continent. Really the only Christian kingdom on the entire African continent. Even though Christianity is here and there through the entire continent, no kingdom is really Christian in the time period we're looking at up to about 1500. So Agilis here, we're looking at that, which is a trade port right on the edge of the Red Sea. Ivory, gold, precious gems, slaves out for fabrics and sugar and spices in. So gold, gem slaves out of Africa for fabric, sugar, and spices into Africa. This was a source of power and wealth for Ethiopia for centuries, and this really connected directly into the Islamic world. Ethiopia's acceptance of Christianity led to it becoming the first African society to really document its history, other than Egypt, of course. Really, the first society to document its history. And it does this because with Christianity usually comes knowledge and writing. Uh, Education comes with Christianity. So mainly through religious texts and royal stories, royal chronicles of its Christian rulers. Really significant. Really significant how these records, how these written records, pretty much follow Christianity wherever it goes. And we get an actual historical count of Ethiopia going back to, well, going back at least 1500 years, give or take. Show the Kingdom of Axum map here, 600 CE. Axum, which is really what becomes Ethiopia. There's Agilis and Axum. We have other places here, other things going on here. This is around 600. It's interesting how this map calls it the Roman Empire. It would have been, well, it would have been maybe Byzantium in this time period, right before the Muslims took it over, right before Muhammad, which Byzantium would have called itself the Roman Empire. So effectively, that's what it is. All right, look at this image. How does the artist, this would be a good discussion question, how does the artist really emphasize the power and strength of the Ethiopian Christians on the left versus the Muslim fighters on the right? First of all, who's winning? Seems pretty obvious. How does it demonstrate how the Ethiopians are more powerful? The Ethiopian Christians are more powerful than the Muslim warriors on the right. Look at size, look at adornment, look at the horses, look at the faces, look at their faces between Ethiopians and the Muslims. Look at where most of the dead bodies are. Look at who most of the dead bodies are. What's this really suggest about wealth and status between the two peoples? Who appears to be wealthier? Who appears to have more money? Hard to tell, but you could come up with some opinions. Looking at things like jewelry, clothing style, things like that. Look at weaponry. There's one very unique weapon in this image, which we haven't really talked about up to this point. But they're out there. We have them already. The difference in clothing is, of course, very significant. Clothing, footwear, all of that. Now, how would this serve as propaganda for the Christian Ethiopians? How would this image be used to prop up Christianity or show the power and authority of Christianity versus the power or authority of Islam? You know, these images glorify one side over the other, but in what way? And if you are a Christian leader of Ethiopia, how do you use these images? How would you use these paintings to show you are more powerful than the Muslim leaders, Muslim kings? That's significant. It's interesting. It really is. So the idea of power and authority here ties directly into religion. So that's a good discussion question. All those good discussion ideas. All right. I think this is going to be the end of our chapter. I think this is the last thing we're going to look at here. Just about the last thing. We're getting close. East African city-states. East African coastal peoples were shaped by their proximity to the Red Sea, which was Arabia, and of course the Indian Ocean, which was India. So East Africa, as I mentioned an hour ago, was more closely tied culturally and economically to the Arabs and the Indians than they were to other Africans due to their connections. It was much easier, frankly, to trade over the water than over the harsh lands of Africa, the mountainous lands, the distances, or you simply hop on a ship and go with the trade winds and end up in some port in India. So it was just easier. These trade routes brought a lot of variety of people in East Africa, really changed the culture there dramatically. As far as back as Greece, the Greeks actually traveled from the Mediterranean through the Red Sea to trade with cities and towns on the east coast of Africa. So for 1,000 years or more, Europeans had already been trading with East Africa. While all of northern and central Africa had been sort of skipped over, Europeans were already connected into East Africa through trade routes with the Greeks. Again, it was just much easier to go by ship than to try going overland across mountains and deserts and thousands of miles and raiders and Berbers and pirate. It was just, don't get me wrong, there were ship pirates as well, of course. Very interesting. Over time, most of these towns on the coast become very cosmopolitan with people that speak different languages, with different cultures. They become very diverse and multi ethnic places with people from Europe, Asia, Africa, India, China. Very interesting. Also, with lots of religion. Now, the core religious belief was animism. This was a core religious belief. It was animistic before Islam comes moving in. Christianity never gets here. Judaism never gets here. So it's animistic until Islam shows up. Then that changes. Eventually, most upper classes convert. And if most upper classes convert, that means the society is officially Islam. Even if the majority of the people were still animistic, if the leaders, the kings, the priests, if all of the upper class converts over to Islam, well, you're officially Islamic now, even if most people aren't. And we already talked about the reasons they would do this. We see very mixed culture, very mixed ethnicities. Arab, Indian, Asian, African, and all of these together we end up calling the Swahili culture from the 8th to the 12th century. With lots of blood mixing here. Many people lived in the Swahili areas. This entire region of the coast were less than half African as far as blood goes. We know this from genetic testing and genetic histories that the people who lived along the East Coast had multiple other genetic norms that came from other continents, other places. So much cross-cultural interaction here, dating back to before Jesus. I mean, dating back 1,000 years. Even though here we're talking about the 8th to the 12th century, these connections between East Africa and Asia and Europe and India had existed for well over a millennia, maybe 2 millennia, long time. The culture of Swahili is named after a Bantu language, another descendant of the Bantu language. It's also influenced by the Arabic language, the Swahili. This becomes a population and a culture distributed along the eastern coast of Africa and the islands, which is also interesting. A lot of this culture, the Swahili, and this next one we're going to talk about, are centered actually on the islands off the coast, which makes sense. You can avoid a lot of warfare and violence by being off the continent because you can't be attacked by other tribes. Warfare was common. And of course, if you are a naval society that wants to deal with trade, you're perfect. You can literally surround your entire island with ports and ships and docks. Perfect. So these became little, to use an analogy we're used to, they became little city states. These little Swahili city states, as it says in the instructions there, as the title there, just like we see in Greece. Basically, a little city surrounding farmland or trade. These little independent, they might have called themselves kingdoms, but that's actually probably stretching it. They were, I guess, some were just literally one single small island, but they might have called themselves kingdoms in some ways. This becomes the most powerful trading empire, and Kilwa becomes the most powerful trading city on the east coast of Africa. Its height was the 13th to the 15th century. mostly due to gold, mostly due to the gold trade. Kilwa became rich and wealthy. Several other cities arise that become very central Indian Ocean trading. This was an island city, and the nearby mainland was controlled and governed by a sheikh. That sheikh is a term usually we think referring to Arabia in the Middle East. That's probably where they learned it from, but that's what they call them. So these were African sheikhs that were in essence they were kings over these small city states. And the wealth of the city states was based on one thing, trade. Not on land, not on animals, as most of other wealth was based. It was based on merchant empires. Lots of goods, lots of different goods, if I have any of them listed here. Slaves, gold, cloth, animal skins, ivory. A lot of the same things we're used to. And at the time, it was exported everywhere. Once you got into the Indian Ocean Trading Network, you could go anywhere. Indian Ocean Trading Network connected Africa to Europe to Asia. So once you were out there, the goods could end up anywhere in the world. Again, the world we don't include here. We don't include America. America still hasn't been discovered, uh, really, as far as we're concerned. So America doesn't include it, but all of Africa, Europe, and Asia has been discovered, and the trade goes all through there. Lots of establishments of Eastern Muslim communities also increase the slave traffic as they connect all across Afro-Eurasia. The slave trade here in the Indian Ocean continued on all the way into just a few decades ago, like the mid 20th century. We still see the slave trade here in the Indian Ocean region between Eastern Africa and India and China. In the world today, technically, slavery doesn't exist anywhere. Every country in the world has outlawed slavery in some way or another. So no country in the world actually allows slavery. Yet, we know there's probably millions of slaves in the world today, mostly along Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, Indonesia. Um, Fishing. We think there's probably a couple million slaves that are on fishing boats in the Oceania region, basically between China and Australia, that entire massive region of water. And it's thousands of islands, probably that, and also sexual slavery. Of course, sexual enforced prostitution. So slaves were really big. Slave trade was big. It always has been, and it still is actually. We believe slave trade is still a real thing in Eastern Asia, even though it's illegal everywhere. Southern Africa and the Great Zimbabwe. That's a picture of it there, photograph. South Africa was isolated by everything. You had more deserts, you had mountain ranges. It was effectively cut off from the entire world until about 500 years ago. Southern Africa really had no connections with any other part of the world. It was entirely isolated until about 500 years ago when the Portuguese showed up off the coast. And the Portuguese show up and they start trying to trade with Africans there. They began sailing around it. It enjoyed a very temperate climate, maybe the best climate in Africa. It wasn't super hot. It had decent amounts of rain. Well, once you stay out of the desert, it was a relatively decent place. It was climate-wise, it was maybe the best place to live in Africa. Had the most moderate temperate climate at all. Of course, some of the most precious resources in the world are located there now. I mentioned that earlier. Platinum, gold, uranium, diamonds. Mineral resources, not fossil fuels, but mineral resources. The most plentiful place in the world is Southern Africa, Southern and Central Africa, with all kinds of precious metals that exist almost nowhere anywhere else in the world, but there. Maybe there is some conjecture about this. Maybe a very large asteroid actually struck Africa, a couple 100 million years ago. Um, and we know asteroids floating around the solar system are just packed full of precious metals that they've collected from basically its residue from dying planets and stars from billions of years or whatever. And these asteroids occasionally crash. Asteroid, meteorite, whatever the hell they call it when they crash. And then, of course, they deposit all those rare metals into the Earth's soil because these are precious metals that exist across southern Africa that are there. Most of those are not found anywhere else in the world. So we think they are very likely extraterrestrial, probably from a crashed asteroid or meteorite millions and hundreds of millions of years ago. Nonetheless, they're there. Um, think cell phones. All the crazy electronics and shit that's in cell phones, a lot of that comes from Central Africa, and you can't find it anywhere else, or it's very limited and very limited supplies anywhere else. Diamonds, platinum, uranium, of course, uranium. Yeah, we know what that's for, don't we? The earliest residents of southern Africa were hunter-gatherers, of course, as everyone was. Societies developed here later than anywhere else in the world. Pretty much later than any place in the world, we see societies in southern Africa. That's because they had no connections. They had no one to learn anything from. Everything that they developed entirely on their own, entirely independently. So they developed later than pretty much everywhere else. We think there were kinship groups as well, probably family kin groups. A lot of money from the gold trade. There is ruins of literally one ancient city, and that's it right there. The Great Zimbabwe. Walls, structures. Um, at least one empire existed in southern Africa. At least one. And which makes it so special is it looks like there is no influences of anyone else on it. So it was entirely independently developed. So a totally independent, unique kingdom or empire developed that covered southern Africa and then went away, faded away. Just a couple centuries before Europeans arrived. And we know nothing about it because there's no evidence of any written language. So it's a civilization that existed, rose up, fell apart, and literally what you see in the photo is about all we have left of it. Nothing else. It's just a shame, it really is. It'd be amazing to actually know what, because it could be because it developed so uniquely different than everywhere else. It would be just amazing to actually know what the culture was like, a totally unique, independent culture that wasn't influenced by Afro-Eurasian societies going back thousands of years. It'd be very interesting. That's it. That's the end of our chapter. So, thanks for taking the ride with me, and yeah, we'll see you next week.